Hello and welcome to episode 119 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this fine morning, Bill?
Doing great, Seth. And as we record this, I know this episode's probably airing in January, but as we record this, tomorrow is Pearl Harbor Day, and December 6th, at this time in 1945, the court-martial of Captain Charles Butler McVeigh was going on at the Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. So this time period in December, when we're recording this, is very historic, near and dear to my heart for a whole bunch of reasons.
And tomorrow is the day that propelled this country into a war that still shapes its future to this very day.
Yes.
This week, we would like to welcome back Dave Holland. Just to give everybody a reminder who, if you've never listened to an episode with Dave, Dave is a former United States Marine. He owns and runs the Facebook and YouTube channel called Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield. He's a Solomon Islands battlefield guide and, most importantly, a Guadalcanal expert. Dave, welcome back, brother. How you been?
Yeah, I've been doing well, and thanks again for having me, and looking forward to our talk.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a good one. We've been building up to this specific event, or actually sequence of events now, for some time, and so have the Japanese. As you will recall, the last several months on Guadalcanal have seen steadily larger Japanese assaults that hit Marines with intents on grabbing Henderson Field. The Japanese have tried and failed at Tenaru in August, tried and came very close at Edson's Ridge in September, tried a few smaller attacks here and there the next several weeks and into the next several weeks, and they were all essentially failures. Now we sit in late October, and the Japanese have finally built enough forces on Guadalcanal for their almighty decisive battle. All the Japanese thrusts, both ashore and at sea, have led to this very operation to this point. This is the all or nothing, if you will, the decisive battle that the Japanese have clamored for and that the Americans have been also preparing for. This is the tipping point, for better or worse. This event, and these events rather, will become known to history as the Battle for Henderson Field. So, preparations, as we always start, we start with our preps. There's a lot of preparations going back and forth, in particular the Japanese. Dave, what are the Japanese doing? What have they been doing to get themselves ready for this momentous set of events?
As you remember, the Japanese had brought the 4th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 2nd Japanese Sendai Division. They'd brought them forward to establish a firing platform on the east bank of the Matanikau for their big guns they were planning on bringing in. So the Japanese decided once and for all they're going to put their main effort behind Guadalcanal and knock these Americans out. So Hayatake, which was the Japanese Lieutenant General, 17th Army Commander, based at Rabaul, landed on the island to take personal and direct command of the operation. I think he landed somewhere around the 17th of October. And the Japanese decided they needed to bring a vast amount of troops and heavy equipment in. And the only way they could really do this was by transports. But as we discussed earlier, the U.S. owned the day with Henderson Field and the land-based carriers or land-based aircraft. And the Japanese were doing the rat runs or the ant runs with the fast destroyers and the barges bringing in troops.
And are they landing at Cape Esperance and trying to bushwhack all the way through the island to get people near Henderson at this point?
Yes, they did land on the northwest coast, but they didn't really have to bushwhack because there was a pre-war coastal road called the government track.
Okay.
So they basically went on the road. It followed roughly around the Cape Esperance, and that's where it ended, around that area. So they had a nice little track. It wasn't a proper road, but there was enough they can move quite quickly through there. Generally at night, because once again the Americans would hit them. So their plan was to neutralize Henderson Field. And if they neutralized Henderson Field, that would allow them to bring the large transports down to unload the heavy guns, which they intended to do, which is the 100 millimeter and 150 millimeter heavy guns, later called Pistol Pete by the Americans. And also allow them to bring a mass amount of troops and tons of supplies and some tanks down to do their coordinated push to take Henderson Field and take the Americans out. So they were setting themselves up, and then I won't go too much into the naval aspects, but Yamamoto with a combined fleet was gathering a large enough fleet. I think the second largest fleet, or the largest fleet since Midway.
Since Midway, yeah.
Yeah, so they were going to try to lure the Americans out and fight a decisive naval battle at the same time once the Japanese land troops had taken Henderson Field. So that's basically where we sit now.
The bombardment or the shelling of the Marines had two purposes then. It was to prepare the battlefield and to lure the American fleet out. Is that right?
Well, the main purpose of the bombardment, and the bombardment was on the night of the 13th and 14th, and any veteran, whether a Marine or the Army, which is the 164th Regiment, will talk about the night of the battleships or the bombardment because it was such a major event. So its main purpose was to neutralize Henderson Field. So they're going to bring two battleships down and basically smash the airfields.
Yeah.
Henderson and Fighter One, which is a auxiliary field about I'd say less a mile away from Henderson.
To the east.
So they brought in the two battleships. They were part of a transport convoy. So the two battleships came in at night. And just like I mentioned, the 164th Army Regiment was the first U.S. Army ground troops to land and support the Marines. But unfortunately for them, they landed on the night, the day of the 13th. That was their welcome to Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
And the bombardment, I think at the two battleships, they fired about 980, 960, a little short of 1,000 14-inch rounds.
Right.
In that area. And as you know, Bill, how big a 14-inch round is and the damage you can do. Something like 320 millimeters. It's just huge. You know, Volkswagen Beetle size, you know.
The guys,
2,000 pounds, yeah.
Anybody who was on, and the battleships Dave's referring to for the listeners, that's the Congo and the Haruna. Anybody who was aboard Guadalcanal this night remembers this night as, unless they were, in hand-to-hand combat somewhere, Edson's Ridge or Tenaroo or what we're going to talk about here in a little while, they remember this night as being the worst night of the campaign. And because these, like Dave said, they fired over 900 rounds of 14-inch munitions at the Marines and the airfield and the airplanes and everything for over, what the hell was it, an hour and a half. I mean, that's just laying it down, and
you can't dig deep enough to get away from one of those shells. So it's hell on earth during that period. And the Marines, having long memories, loved naval gunfire support, remembering when they were on the wrong end of naval gunfire, how bad that was. And so Marines to this day really want the Navy to continue to provide that kind of support for when they do landings.
And bring out the old New Jersey, huh?
Yeah.
This was the worst night of shelling that those guys ever endured to this point and after. This was the worst.
Well, I'll take it another step on that one, Seth. I mean, I'm trying to rack my memory and I can't think of another time where Allied troops in World War II was subject to such intense bombardment.
No, not from heavy naval rifles. No, this is the worst.
That was the first night. I mean, it happened over two more nights. As we'll probably discuss, not 14-inch, but 8-inch and 5-inchers hit them too.
But as far as the battle wagons are concerned,
none of the European theaters saw anything like this.
No.
Okay. No. Nowhere else in the Pacific theater.
Wait, no. This is the only time in the Pacific that United States forces are withering underneath the power of battleship shelling for a continuous. Now, to be clear, battle wagons had shelled Henderson Field before,
right?
But not to this degree, not to this intensity, and for this length of time. And I'm making a big point of this because, like Dave said, this was to soften up the positions. This was to knock out Henderson Field, so the Japanese could move their people into the island unmolested by the unsinkable aircraft carrier. And it damn near did it. According to what I was able to find for this episode, it destroyed about half, or damaged at least half of the Cactus Air Force. The battleship shelling did. I mean, it put a shellac in it. It temporarily knocked out both airfields. I granted one of them, I think it was Fighter One, was repaired before Henderson was. Dave, you might be able to comment on that. And it was repaired within a couple of hours. Like once daybreak broke, it was back up and running. But still, I mean, the Marines didn't have a whole hell of a lot of airplanes on there in the first place, and they knocked out, the Japanese battleships knocked out about half of them in an hour and a half.
Think of the guys, the engineers that had to get out, and that with that shelling, and then resurface those runways again. Were those Army combat engineers?
CBs.
6
CB battalion.
Yeah,
did a lot of good work there.
Yeah.
So it was a nasty night, and this is kind of the door is opening to this hellish couple of weeks that are coming up with this battleship shelling. Getting back to the Japanese, Dave, you'd said that the Japanese had been steadily moving troops into the area, and they've been moving them in there for weeks and weeks and weeks. The main assault was set for the 22nd of October. At least that was the date that they were trying to target for their operations, were they not?
I think around the 20th originally, in the very early stages of the planning, because they brought I forgot his last name, but he was like the chief of staff or a planner for the Japanese, the colonel. And he was the guy had been involved in a lot of the good strategic planning operations in the very first of the war. So he had a great reputation. So he was the guy that had planned all this, and they brought him in directly too.
Okay. To distract, and this is like, you said he brought him in the plan, and this was there was one aspect of the Japanese plan that was probably not so well planned out, and they continued to want to try and go through the jungle, but they really didn't have any other options. But they tried a lot of diversionary attacks to keep the Americans away from where they actually intended to launch their main assault. Let's talk about some of these events that lead up to the big thrust. The Japanese were still under the assumption that there were only like 10,000 Americans ashore at this time, and there were well over 23,000 men in American uniform on Guadalcanal at this time. I mean, that's
Marines and Army, right? What's the ratio of Marines to Army at this point?
Oh, it's heavily in favor of the Marines there, I'm sure.
It's about 3,000 Army. Okay. A little, almost 3,000 or 4,000 is the 164th.
Yeah, I was going to say it's about 4 to 1, I think.
And a few Army Air Corps.
Yeah. The Americans, we know that a large scale assault is, I guess you could say it's underway, to an extent, but we also know that the Japanese are trying to plan for this. They're trying to set this up. The addition of the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment, we talked about this the last time, gave Vandergrift a total of 13 infantry battalions to defend the perimeter in an almost continuous line. Dave, can you talk to us about the way the Vandergrift had set our defenses up, set our people up?
Yeah, Vandergrift, I think we talked in the last episode, he had a active defense, and that was a strategy. But in the Great War, sorry, I'm Australian, in World War I, the way to set up a defensive line was they learned, especially toward the end of the war, was defense in depth, not the cordon defense, which is basically a cordon defense. As you know, it's just a straight line with little reserves, a little defense in depth. Well, Vandergrift had set up a cordon defense around the airfield, because that's really all the resources he had to set that up. Some of the some of these commanders like Clifton Cates, which was the first regimental commander, really didn't like it, because once again, he had the Great War head on, or the World War I head on. He said, this is the way we've been training for the last 20, 30 years. But what that allowed Vandergrift to do, he put 2 battalions up front, 1 battalion in the rear. And those battalions in the rear became his maneuver battalion. So if they needed to go out with that passive defense very quickly and go on a limited offense to push the Japanese back, that gave him the capacity, these reserve battalions, to form like a task group, if you want, so to speak, and push out past their perimeter and push the Japanese back. But in this cordon defense, especially the Marines have been getting supplies like the big September supply with the 7th Marines. The 164th came in, allowed the Marines to really dig in. So they have started establishing, especially on that southern line in the thick jungle and on the on Bloody Ridge and all that area, allowed them to dig in. They had a lot of covered bunkers, machine gun bunkers, aprons of barbed wire, no landmines at this stage, but they had some improvised mines on the Matanical, but they were allowed to dig in and have a good defensive position. In fact, in some of these defensive positions, the machine gun, especially on the southern line, almost every bunker was manned with a machine gun. So where do you think they got these machine guns from? A couple of good sources. One, when the LVT-1s, the first Amtracs, they purposely outfitted these things with like 3 and 4 light machine guns, and maybe a couple of 50 cals on them. So they stripped these Amtracs, and plus also the boneyard, the aircraft graveyard.
Yep.
Especially the Marines and the 7th Marines on that southern line near the Fighter 1 where the boneyard was. They would go down the supply tracks, go to the aircraft, pick up a machine gun, and bring it back to the bunker.
This is an airplane machine gun that you're talking about.
Yeah, airplane machine. Well, generally 30 cals.
30 cal, yeah.
Mainly 30 cals. You could just see, me being an old Marine private, I could just see this. You're sitting in your bunker with your 03 bolt action rifle, sitting there thinking, oh, I love my rifle. And you're looking, and Johnny's walking back with a 30 cal machine gun, Private Johnny. And you go, hey, Johnny, where'd you get that machine gun? Oh, just, go back 100 yards, and they got a bunch of them on those planes. I'm gonna go get me a machine gun. So you just see a private, they all just get them machine guns, and probably that's why every bunker had a machine gun. In fact, Vanderbilt,
where they get the ammunition from, though. I mean,
Oh yeah,
well, 30 cal, yeah.
I don't know, 30 cal or 50 cal. But someone had like 3 or 4. But it was so well established. Vandergrift did a tour of the lines in October around Puller's 17, and he basically said, this is the machine gunner's paradise when he walked through. But yeah, so that's how Vandergrift had established his line. So they had a good, well established and strong defensive position with a cordon defense.
To go back to your point about the machine guns, that's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's 100% accurate what you said about Marines pilfering automatic weapons from shot up airplanes or airplanes that got the crap shot out of them by the bombardment. To put this in perspective, the weapons that the Marines had at their hands, in their TO, and it's the 1917 water cooled and the 1919 A4 air cooled machine gun. Their cyclic rate is roughly very similar. It's about 750 to 850, maybe 900 rounds a minute. Still, it's kicking, but it's not super fast. However, the weapons that were in the back of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the weapons, and I'm talking about the twin 30 calibers that could easily be broken apart into one, is the A&M2 30 caliber. It's a derivative of the 1919, but this thing's got a cyclic rate of about 12 to 1400 rounds a minute. So if you know what a German MG42 is, that was the cyclic rate of the MG42. So these things could really lay down the lead. These are not your average American machine guns. It's certainly not your average American infantry machine guns. These are some serious man-killing machines here. It's some serious firepower that these guys are adding. And there's pictures of this stuff. They're like homemade, like jerry-rigged machine guns. They're really, really cool. Really cool weapons. To that end, as the Marines are reinforcing their line and building these heavy bunkers and really tying in tight as a tick, the Japanese are moving towards their launch point, and they're doing what they've done previous. They're hacking their way through the jungle, and this is the main assault now, or what would be the main assault theoretically, is they're hacking their way through the jungle, and they're doing this for days on end, are they not, Dave? And they're going pretty much undetected by American eyes, are they not?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back. So the Japanese plan, once again, their plans wasn't too bad, all 3, especially major offenses. So their plan was on the mouth of Matanical to have a fight or a holding action. So the Vandergrift and Thomas's chief of staff reckon that they determined this is where the main Japanese assault would come from, because they knew the Japanese had tanks. And the only way only place they could attack with tanks was across the mouth of Matanicow. So that's when Vandegrift had deployed 2 forward battalions. So the Japanese were going to, with basically the 4th Infantry Regiment, the Japanese tank company was going to hold the Marines at the mouth of Matanicow. They had Colonel Oka, with 124th, was going to go downstream, cross the Nippon Bridge, and do a flank attack on those 2 forward battalions, which had basically a fish hook type position. So going to hit up on the ridge, come down and cut them off. And at the same time, the main effort involving the 2nd Sendai Division and elements of the 38th Division, which you had the 16th Regiment, 29th Regiment of the 2nd Division, and the 230th Regiment of the 38th Division under Kawaguchi, our old friend from Bloody Ridge. Mm-hmm. They were going to cut basically it's a 30 to 35 mile trail. Murayama, which was the 2nd Division commander, to this day it's called the Murayama Trail. They called it the Murayama Road, but it wasn't a road. It was just a small jungle trail. They'd sent their engineers in probably a week before to start cutting a trail, 35 miles, basically south around Mount Austin, to hook in through the jungle, hit the upper Lunga River. Then they were going to go straight down the Lunga River. The Japanese plans, one attack on the left side and the right side, and basically go up over Bloody Ridge and strike the Marines from the south. And that was going to be their main effort. Once again, the Japanese tactics was supposed to be a concentrated attack at a small position. And as you mentioned earlier, they estimated the Marines only had 10,000. This is all about replication of almost the other 2 attacks they did. Yep. You know, they hit them at a fixed point, underestimation of the Marine numbers, and that was what they were going to do.
Yeah.
And they thought if they could go down south through the jungle, they would be undetected from the plains, and more importantly, the Solomon Islanders scouts. So don't use the existing native trails, because the scouts would pick it up, and obviously use a jungle canopy to cover your movement.
Which to a point they were, you know, they were undetected for a while anyway, obviously. But go ahead, Bill.
So no, I was going to say, they were going to simultaneously attack along the Matanicow in the west, and then across the Lunga in the east. That's
basically up the Lunga. They're going to come from
the Lunga. Those
look
are
at a map.
Again, not having been there, that seems like those 2 attack points are pretty far apart.
Yeah, they are. They're on land. They're about 8 miles.
And they've got to resupply those 2. They're not internal lines of communication to resupply. They're having to go through jungle, and that's a heavy logistic burden.
And you mentioned it there. That's one of the favors that the Vandegrift had. He had internal lines of supply,
right,
and movement, so he could move very quickly. So whatever the Japanese hit him, he could move his forces very quickly. But at this stage, you only had 1 reserve battalion. That was the 3rd Battalion, the 2nd Marines, and he had those guys mounted. A lot of those. I think he had 2 whole companies mounted on trucks and jeeps to form a quick mobile task force to respond to any threats from the Japanese. But once again, the Marine High Command thought the Japanese main effort would be on the west, so they were completely duped from the Japanese southern attack.
Well, let's talk about the tank. Well, it's not just a tank attack, but the attack along the Matanicow that you alluded to just a couple minutes ago, talking about it's the only place the Japanese can send tanks. So that's where we're going to put our anti-tank defenses. Let's talk about this. This occurs on the 23rd, right? It occurs on the 23rd around dusk, under a Colonel Nakaguma. Along with he attacks along with 9 tanks. It's a variety. It's several different varieties of tanks, but altogether it's about 9 armored vehicles that make this assault try to make this assault across Matanicow.
And this is close to the beach that they're doing this assault.
It's damn near on the beach. Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
It's sandbar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because there's pictures of these tanks that are knocked out. When were those pictures taken, Dave? Like a couple days later or a couple weeks later?
Yes, the intact ones, because I think like 3 or 4 weeks later, you'll see some photos of them. They just blown to bits, because what was happening is the Japanese were infiltrating guys in those tanks and using them for sniper positions. So I've got a couple of good photos. One from inside the bunker, which is a great one. One of the tanks, the engineers put demo charges and blew them to pieces. So yeah. But the Japanese had landed 12 tanks, and they did a couple of probing attacks in a couple of days before, where they tried to push across. One tank got hit and then they pulled back. But yeah, the 23rd was their main assault.
Well, let's talk about that assault. What goes down there? What happens in that event?
So what happens? The Japanese had planned in 5 days. Their planned attack was the 22nd. That was going to be their main attack, but they kept getting delayed. The southern movement, due to the jungle, mainly in the terrain. They underestimated the terrain. So the guys were basically in single file line. They were dumping their heavy guns, because you remember the 75 and the 70 millimeter Japanese infantry guns. They broke them down and man-packed them. So they were ditching those things. Each Japanese soldier was given a shell, like a 70 or 75 millimeter shell. And to this day, if you go to the Murayama track or trail, you can still find, 70s and 75 millimeters tossed in the bush, because they just, it's just too much. But anyway, they kept getting delayed in the jungle. So there's a couple of two theories that the attack on the 23rd, either the colonel or the general, there was a major general on scene. I forgot what his name was, Shuriyama. He was actually the major general, one of the major generals. There's 3 major generals involved in this attack, but he was a major general in charge of the Guadalcanal. Either he didn't get the word that the attack was delayed, or I think some of the Japanese, to save face, they said later, "Oh, we purposely attacked on that day to draw the Americans there." So what the Americans did, they had the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marines and the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Marines on that forward deployed. And they had a great position there. And they actually had searchlights. They had a jury-rigged lights, and they had like a shield on one side of sandbags. And they had the lights that could focus straight up the river and cover the sandbank. So the sandbags were on the front facing the Japanese, so the Japanese could shoot the searchlights out. And they had I forgot how they rigged it. I think they rigged them on Amtrak lights or truck lights. So they had that rigged up. And then they had some improvised explosives, and they had obviously barbed wire machine guns, and had some 37 millimeter, very importantly, 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. And they had one of their M3 half tracks, I think maybe a couple, with a 75 millimeter guns mounted. So they were dug in. The Japanese decided that at that stage, the only time in the campaign they had a concentrated bombardment. Normally the Japanese would fire 1 to 2 rounds from an individual gun, but they decided to do a concentrated bombardment. I think the day before they hit them with a bombardment, but it's supposed to be a major bombardment to cover the attack. Then the Japanese tanks were going to shoot across the sandbar. Then the 4th Infantry Regiment was going to follow infantry tank supported attack. So the Japanese did launch their artillery bombardment, softened up the Marine positions, didn't really do that much. Tanks come across in single file, and the 37 millimeters started taking them out.
Pick them
bang,
off.
bang,
Yeah.
bang, bang. One Japanese tank managed to make it across. I forgot the private's name, but a Marine private put a hand grenade in the track and disabled the track, and a 75 millimeter half track took it out. The Japanese tank attack was just stopped in its tracks, literally. The infantry attack was basically wiped out. So the 4th Infantry Regiment was basically destroyed, what remnants of it, by the Marine concentrated artillery. So what the Marine artillery, they fired 6,000 plus rounds in a short period of time. And what the Marines registered, they had ladders. They called the ladder registers, so that you can picture a ladder, and it was going east to west. And each gun, I think, had 50 yards wide and something like 100 yards long.
Right.
And that was your register of fire. So once they got the word to fire, they just walked up and down, firing 100 yards or maybe 150, maybe 200 yards, but 50 yards wide, back and forth, concentrated, and they were overlapping. And it was just, you read the survivors' accounts, they just said we were basically destroyed before they even started attack. So that whole attack was wiped out.
Yeah, you're not getting out of an artillery barrage like that.
Not that concentrated.
Hell no, absolutely not. And I mean, we've, praised Marine artillery when we did the Edson's Ridge episode, and rightfully so. But this is also one of the examples that where the 11th Marines and the other artillery batteries that were there, where, I mean, they just whipped that ass all day, all evening long. And I read some accounts, Dave, that the Marines that were in the holes that were manning the line, in between very short pauses in between the artillery bursts, they could hear the Japanese audibly, screaming and moaning and hollering and, in pain in between the bursts. And then boom, 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 here it would come again and again, almost like a World War I style, no man's land artillery preparation, where they just pounded that area to
without
virtually
the trenches.
Nothing. Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, they just pounded it to nothing. Pounded it to powder. Yeah, I think we need to mention too at this point, while this attack is starting to unfold, this offensive is a more appropriate term. General Vandergrift, General Vandergrift, he ain't there, is he?
No, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Holcomb, Thomas Holcomb, had visited Guadalcanal in around probably a week before.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of good pictures of walking around and touring the sites and visiting everyone. So at that stage, he took Vandergrift back. I don't know if you mentioned in the episode yet that Halsey's taken control from Gormley.
Right.
So Halsey calls a meeting back in New Caledonia. So they went back to meet with Halsey and the Army units, Army General like Paige and a few others to have a command group. So he wasn't in charge. So they brought Rupertus, who was over in Tulagi, Brigadier General Rupertus. If I'm stuttering a bit, it's 04:45 early in the morning. So yeah, I'm still waking up. I have my coffee.
We're all a bit handicapped. Yeah, you're ODART 30, and I had oral surgery last week, so we're all kind of stumbling around here.
But you're a Marine, all right. 4 o'clock reveille. That's not unusual for you. My goodness. Yeah.
But they brought Brigadier General Rupertus, he'd been at Basilone on Tulagi, he's the commander over there. So they brought him in to take overall control. Remember, he still had Geiger, which is the air commander. At that stage, he was I think he was promoted to Major General on Guadalcanal because he arrived as a brigadier. But anyway, some reports say that Geiger was in charge, which isn't correct. It was Rupertus in charge, but you still had the chief of staff, General Thomas. So he was kind of the brains behind everything anyway. So anyway, yeah, Vandergrift wasn't on the island when all this was going on.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in another episode, but Halsey took command of Southwest Pacific on October 18th, I believe, relieving his old Naval Academy football teammate, Robert Gormley, and famously said, "This is the hottest potato I've ever been handed." And so he called the subordinate commanders to New Caledonia to get a briefing and then let him go back. And a few weeks later, I think he visited Guadalcanal himself.
He does. A couple times.
A couple times, yeah. But we'll cover that separately. So this is within the first few days of his command assignment when all of this is going down.
This would be 5 days.
5 days,
5 days after he takes the reins of this horse, if you will. Let's talk about the main event, because there's a lot to talk about here. So let's get to the meat of the sandwich here. At first light, now we previously mentioned that the Japanese are moving through the jungle. They're moving through the jungle track that their engineers are hacking out of the woods there, out of the boonies. And for the most part, they're moving undetected by the Marines. The Marines don't necessarily know that they're there. Blah, blah, blah. However, at first light on the 24th of October, there are some Marines that do see some movement out along the Matanikau area. There's Japanese infantry on a ridge, apparently, to the left rear of the American lines. Can we talk about this, Dave? Can you enlighten us a little bit more on that information on that sighting?
Yeah, I think you mean the Lunga. For the southern,
yeah. My bad.
Right, but there was Oka on the Matanikals, and they were spotted too.
Sure.
The next day, but yeah. So I think the whaling group, we talked about it in the last episode. It was the group of scout snipers they developed. I'd love to know more about them, and we don't find much information on them. But one of their scouts had picked up, he'd seen a Japanese officer on the ridge with a set of binoculars observing. They also seen Japanese rice fires or cooking fires around the upper Lunga. And they knew there was some Japanese movement coming that way. So it wasn't enough for the Marines to bolster that southern line. Because at that stage, the southern line, I'll mention it now when I'm thinking about it, the southern line, once again, the Marine High Command thought the Japanese main assault was going to be on the Botanical. So on the southern line, and then at that stage, Vandergrift had divided his defenses in sectors so he could respond quickly. And the area around Bloody Ridge and the jungle flat to the east of it to a place called Coffin Corner, where it hooked in with the U.S. Army, with the 164th had taken over that line, was Sector 3. So 2nd Battalion and the 7th Marines were up on Bloody Ridge, manning those defensive positions. Down in the jungle flat was the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, and the 3rd Battalion of 7th Marines was forward deployed. So what were they going to do was pull the 7th Marines out and put them all up on the Botanical. So they didn't think an attack was coming from the south. You had the 2 forward battalions on the Botanical with their left flank exposed. And they knew the Japanese had picked up some Japanese on the left flank. And they said, well, if the Japanese assault, they'll cut me these 2 forward battalions off. So they pulled the 2nd Battalion and the 7th Marines under Hannikin. They pulled them out and they put them up on the ridge on the left-hand side to support those 2 forward battalions of the Botanical. So what that did was that left 1-7 under Puller. And they thought, well, we'll leave Puller and his regiment down there because they've had a bit of a tough time in the preceding couple of weeks. We'll leave them down there to rest. So they covered 2,500-yard line. And he only had 500 men effectively. So the way Puller, he kept his guys in those bunkers in the jungle flat. The way he filled those 2-7 positions, he pulled 1 platoon from every rifle company and some of his headquarter guys, and he formed a composite company, I think under Captain Kelly, and they put him up on those ridge, on Bloody Ridge. So he was very well spread out. So he only had 500 guys for 2,500 yards.
Yeah. And
they're about to accept the whole attack of roughly 9,000 Japanese.
Yeah.
So the Japanese, that was how the plan they could concentrate it. So yeah, that's how we stood there.
It's reminiscent what you just said. You know, they left Puller there, or Puller's people there, to give them some rest because they'd had a hard time of it. If you know anything about the European theater, you think of the Ardennes and December, well, right about now, and you know, early to mid December 1944, where the Ardennes was a quiet, it was a quiet sector. We're going to put these people here so they can rest. Yeah, well, the Germans had other thoughts, and the Japanese have very similar thoughts here, unrelated, obviously, but kind of similar in the same way. You talked about Puller, and we've talked about him, you know, in the last episode ad nauseum, but this is kind of his moment of glory, his and his people's moment of glory here. He, knowing full well that his unit is literally stretched thin, you know, too damn thin, frankly. Puller, being Puller, personally goes to each and every that he could find emplacement and personally checks and says, okay, do this, move this here, get rid of this, add this here, all this kind of stuff. Because he's no fool. He knows that, yeah, you know, we're in a quiet sector, but more than likely, you know, we're going to get hit with something if this attack does develop. So he is preparing his positions for this very event that comes to light. Now we talked about it earlier, Dave, and we kind of went into some of the personalities in the 7th Marines. There's a couple of really famous personalities that are in the 7th Marines, both enlisted. Well, one was enlisted, one later an officer. But there's one in particular who everybody knows. Everybody's heard of this cat, John Basilone. Let's talk about Basilone. Basilone, can you give us a little brief bio on John Basilone? Who was he? You know, we all know who he was, but for the new listener, who was John Basilone and what was his job? Where was he at before this event started?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could go a lot into Basilone, but I'll go very briefly. Basilone, I think he's born in Buffalo, raised in New Jersey, typical from an Italian-American family. Joined the U.S. Army in the 30s as a private. I don't know what rank he got up to. I think maybe private first class. But he was a machine gunner in the 31st Infantry Regiment based in the Philippines. He was a good boxer. professional heavy machine gunner. That was his main role. Earned the title Manila John from his Philippine days. I think he did his 3 or 4 years in the Army. He got out, went back to New Jersey, but then became a truck driver. Got a bit bored, like we all do when we get out after 4 years and get stuck back in hometown USA, so to speak. I could reminisce with him and I can relate to him. And he probably wanted to get back and see some more action, and he wanted to go back overseas again. So he joined the Marines, and like I think I said somewhere else before, if you're a Marine listening to this or a former Marine, cover your ears. Basilone didn't go to Marine boot camp, which was common in those days. If you had prior service, especially in the Army, you didn't have to go to boot camp again. So they accepted him straight in the Marines pre-war. And him being a professional machine gunner, he went straight to machine guns in the 5th Marine Regiment. And shortly after, in 41, when the 7th Marine Regiment was formed, he went into the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines as a machine gun section leader, which is he was a sergeant at that stage. And he was a professional machine gunner. The reports state that he was very, very well versed and very capable machine gunner and machine gun team leader. And when they landed on the island, at that stage, Basilone, being a heavy machine gun, he wasn't involved in some of the other episodes that 1-7 had been in, like the little Dunkirk action we discussed. It was heavy guns. They was left back in the perimeter. He wasn't really involved in the 3rd Battle of Guadalcanal, so he hadn't really seen much action at that stage apart from bombardment. Mm-hmm. But he had a section of 4 heavy machine guns. And sometimes if you read his Medal of Honor citation and some of the other reports on Basilone, that he had 2 machine guns, but people misinterpret that it was 2 machine gun sections,
right?
Which consisted of 4 1917 heavy machine guns, roughly 6. I think a strength on paper of 16 men, and plus the sergeant. So he wasn't a platoon sergeant. He was a section leader.
Yeah, those are the water-cooled machine guns?
They are.
Yes.
Yeah. So as an Italian-American growing up in small town Ohio, there were several Italian Americans whose name kind of tripped off the tongue. Sinatra, obviously, Joe DiMaggio, and Basilone was one of those I knew as a boy. Oh, I mentioned before that my uncle Joe Talone, Italian name, right, was in Guadalcanal in the Army, and he's the one who first mentioned Basilone to me. He didn't know him, but he knew of him, and he described him to me as saying he's a pretty good guy for a Marine. So, so that's how I learned the name Basilone, and we were very proud of him.
We're going to hear about John here and Manila John here in just a minute.
Yeah.
As the Japanese under Maruyama are approaching the area, thought to be, and this is key, thought to be the correct position for the attack, they begin to get bogged down again by the jungle, and now also heavy rain. Now this is going to be on October 24th.
Yes.
The night, well, I guess it'd be the evening.
Late evening of the 24th.
Evening, early night, 24 October. The original kickoff time for the attack on the American lines was supposed to be around 1900. 1900 comes and goes because of the rain, and there's some miscommunication, and the Japanese are kind of lost in the jungle at night as they're continuing to grope towards the American lines. Now, finally, around 2200 hours, elements of Colonel Shoji, this is all part of this attack. This is all part of this offensive force. He kind of literally stumbles into some of Puller's defensive emplacements in that very section that we just talked about. The fighting was short, but it was pretty fierce there, as Puller's men eventually did drive off the attackers. The Japanese didn't really make any progress, but this is kind of the kickoff for the event that follows, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah, so the 230th, I mentioned before, was part of 38th Division. So Shoji was in charge then. There was the column that old friend Kawaguchi,
mm-hmm.
Bloody Ridge, was initially in charge of, but Kawaguchi told Maruyama push to attack from another position, and he was relieved in the field, relieved of command in the field, Kawaguchi, and Shoji took over. Now Shoji, the 230th, was basically, they were on the far right. And they had a small involvement in the whole fight, kind of like Bloody Ridge with that 3rd Battalion of Kawaguchi. Right. So, and then later later in November, that this was a regiment that the 2nd Raiders went after. But yeah, they did some minor contact with the A company of 17, but I'll put a bit of step before they made that contact. The Marines had an outpost. If you go to my videos, you will see it's called Briggs Outpost. It's a 46-man combat outpost, roughly 1,000 yards in front of the lines. It's just a barren hill that sticks out 1,000 yards in front of the Marine lines. And what the Marines were doing, they were rotating a combat platoon every day. They rotated every day because it was fairly demotivating for the Marines to be stuck 1,000 yards out as bait, they called it. So Puller didn't want his men out there. He pushed for regimental command to say, look, can I pull my guys back? They're sitting ducks out there. But it was overruled at regiment and a later division level that said, no, these guys are a great outpost. So if you go up on Briggs Outpost to this day, it's not too many tourists actually go there because it's off limits. It's part of the police firing range, actually. But I got a video just on Briggs Outpost. It's a good view. So anyway, you had a small outpost and up there. And Ralph Briggs was a sergeant platoon commander. They didn't have a lieutenant at that stage. And that was why to this day it's called Briggs Outpost, because he was the last platoon there. So they knew the Japanese were coming around them. There's a famous scene in the HBO Pacific series. It shows Briggs up on the field phone. He had a field phone line to Puller. And he's reporting, he said, the Japanese are here. And Puller basically said, how many? He said, the whole effing Japanese army. He says, that many. So he told him to pull out and push off to the left, which is the left side of the Marine lines, and infiltrate through the army. And he said, we'll give you 10 minutes. So then it's a long way to go. And these poor guys were caught. You can imagine these 46 Marines, middle of the night. You got thousands of Japanese around them. You got all these Marines ready, armed and ready to kill anything in front of them. So, and if you read the accounts of that 46-man platoon, it's very because I've got a lot of their accounts. It's very interesting. I think only 4 didn't make it back, which is very amazing. But anyway, they were the kind of, and the Japanese knew they were there. The Japanese wasn't going to bog down. They said, we'll just infiltrate around these guys, no problem. We'll clean them up later. So the Marines had probably 10, 15-minute window that, the Japanese are coming. So they had a field phone line, and the field phone line was on open line. So most of the Marines could hear it. And that's why if you speak to the Marines, they could hear people talking over the lines, and they knew exactly what was happening. And Basilone, in his own statements, in his own testimony, said he was listening to the field phone. And he said he could hear the outpost saying the Japanese are coming.
So there's a little interesting episode here, Dave. You and I talked about this via email. I guess last week it was. I don't remember now, but these very Japanese, or some of them anyway, send in a message back saying that they captured. That they were on Henderson Field, that they were on the airfield. And this is around, it's around the same time. It's what 2,200, 2,300 hours or something like that ish.
Yeah, some of the first elements in the first assaults, the 29th regiment was their initials. They sent back reports. Their code word was Banzai. And Banzai was supposed to be the word that when the combined fleet, that was to be their trigger word. When the combined fleet heard the word Banzai, that meant the airfield was taken. And they were going to shoot down. In fact, they had I forgot what unit, for a small amphibious assault straight on Lunga Point. That was the 4th element that would never come to fruition. But that Banzai.
But Matsumoto was one of several people who falsely claimed to have taken the airfield. And to give him, a little benefit of the doubt, this is at night in the jungle. I mean, is there a way that they could have mistakenly believed they were there when they weren't actually there?
Yes. And my theory is, at the time, the Seabees was building an auxiliary airfield, emergency airstrip, right in front of Coffin Corner area, where, especially if you go to my videos, you'll see the Coffin Corner area, they named it Coffin Corner, the bowling alley. It was called the bowling alley, named by the Army, because the Army was manning that position, and they hooked in at a place called Coffin Corner, the Jeep Trail, with the 7th Marines. And that whole area is about 200 yards wide and about almost 2,000 yards long. And Briggs Outpost basically looked straight down the bowling alley. So it was and they had triple and double canopy of barbed wire all there. And they were building an airstrip there, auxiliary airstrip. In fact, there were some roller machines and some airfield building machines still left there.
Mhm.
So my theory is when the Japanese, because they had attacked straight across that. So they've come out of that thick jungle, very disorientated at night. And a lot of these guys wouldn't have that accurate of maps. And they've hit an airstrip and they immediately thought, we're on the airstrip now. And they actually overran it because that was part of no man's land, or that was the killing zone, so to speak.
Mhm.
And that was in the middle of Bowling. So I
And
think
the Marines were happy that they overran it because that was the registered killing zone.
It was a big killing zone. So I think they've hit it, especially when they see some airfield equipment and the actually airfield there, because it was an airfield. I think they mistook that for
Bonsai. Yeah. Right.
And they've just said bonsai because they were so, you can imagine in the heat of the combat, they're so excited and adrenaline going.
So it wasn't so much that Matsumoto and these other guys were lying or exaggerating. It's that they really were confused.
Yeah, of course. And you can realize and see why they would
absolutely.
be.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting though. And that's something you don't really, what you just said, Dave, your theory, I completely buy that, because that's something you don't read about in a lot of books. Even Rich Frank's book, Guadalcanal, that is not mentioned in there in any way, shape, or form that there was a third airfield, if you will, that was either under construction or partially constructed or what the hell ever. And it makes it out. History makes this report that's sent out by Matsumoto, and it is, just to be clear, it's Colonel Matsumoto. He sends the signal at 2300 Banzai. A little before 2300, the right wing captured the airfield, quote unquote. That's the exact wording of the message that was sent out. It makes it out. History makes it out to be yet another erroneous Japanese statement of victory or
braggadocio or whatever. Exaggeration.
And to even the well-learned Guadalcanal student, that's what it's filed under. But what you just said is, revolutionary, really. When you look at this specific episode of this specific event, that makes complete sense. It makes total sense, and I think that's really, really cool that you uncovered something like that for the show, because that's something that it's never really been documented before, and it makes sense. It makes complete sense as to what happened there, and that message that is sent triggers a lot of other things that are going to follow. We're going to talk about in a different episode, specifically with the Imperial Japanese Navy, but that message kind of kicks over an anthill for things that follow later on. The left wing of the Japanese assault, this is the right wing, is it not, Dave?
The right wing is basically hitting the Coffin Corner area, the bowling alley. Yeah.
Right. What's going on?
Open field. They, as you know, they gravitate, especially coming out of the thick jungle, they gravitate to an open area.
Open area, sure. Yeah. What's going on the left wing right now?
So the left wing of that same southern line, and there's some myths that said the fighting was on Bloody Ridge. There was no fighting on Bloody Ridge at all. If you go, it's all thick, flat jungle, swampy jungle line. So the Marines had 3 tracks. They had one at the Jeep Trail at Coffin Corner, which come out of the jungle and is an open area, and that led to Fighter 1. And then they had 2 more trails, and the 2 more trails was in the thick jungle, and that led to the combat outpost. And the Marines there's a famous photo with a Chair de Fray. I'm just butchering my French, but it looks like the old Civil War defenses when it's a coconut log with spikes through it, wooden spikes. Yeah. There's a good, one of my friends, he's actually still alive, who manned a 37 millimeter, George Mason. Spoke to him in March, and his memory is great. He's in that photo. He's the guy on the far upper left. And he was the 37 millimeter that Basilone's guns were supporting. They were covering that gate in C Company lines. And C Company they were covering a Sector 3 trail, which was a track straight through the line, a thick jungle. You got to remember, moving through the jungle at night, thick jungle, you want to find that path of least resistance. And that's how the Japanese infiltrations did. In fact, the Marines had built firing lanes of 75 to 100 yards into the jungle, and they covered them with the heavy machine guns, or the machine guns, hoping the Japanese would come in that thick jungle, go into the firing lanes, and they could have a kill zone. And that's what they did. So that Sector 3 trail was a vital trail. And that brings us back to Basilone. So Basilone's guns, he had 4 guns. two bunkers, roughly 30 yards apart. They had two guns in each bunker. He was in the left bunker, and there was a right bunker. And they were covering that sector 3 track or trail, and had a 37 millimeter not too far from them. So when the Japanese attacked, unfortunately, they had to attack piecemeal. 100 guys at a time, 50 guys at a time, platoon, company strength. So they feed them in piecemeal.
But you say that, but they're attacking what, 6 guys, 8 guys in those 2 bunkers?
Well, no, the whole line, their whole line. But what they were doing, they were past the least resistance. They had a trail. So they had 2 trails. Mm-hmm. So the Japanese attacked down the trails. You think, well, that's a bit silly, but if you go there and anyone said that's never been walked through a jungle, thick jungle at night.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. I guarantee you're going to take the path of least resistance, especially if you just humped 35 miles over 7 days with no food.
Very little food.
Very little, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. and you basically spent by the time you get there.
Yeah.
So they're taking a path of least resistance. So it's not like massive assault waves of 300 or 400 guys rushing. It's basically people, squad, 20, 30, 40 guys at a time rushing up a trail, mm-hmm. in a single file. And then once they hit a small clearing, which the Marines had small clearings, Basilone himself in his testimony said he could see 33 feet to the barbed wire line. He could see roughly 25 or 30 feet on the other side. That's their only field of fire they had. Yeah. So he roughly had 50, 70 yards field of fire. But what they'd done, he had 4 to 5 foot high barbed wire. There's some great photos of it.
Well, your video on this is terrific, by the way. Really does show. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, they were going to hang the Japanese up on that barbed wire.
Yeah.
And delay them so the machine guns could basically kill them.
Pick them off. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So they had that gate I was saying, and they can move that gate, and they allow the patrols to move out every day down that jungle track, and allow the outpost guys to come back and forth. So that was what was happening down south. They were pushing them in piecemeal, a company at a time.
So they're trying, the Japanese are trying to, once they hit that area, they hit that barbed wire area, they begin trying to kind of, infiltrate, there is no better term. They're snipping the wire, all that kind of deal. They are advancing somewhat undetected, but it's one of these weird things where, as Bill and I have referred to them before, like the gods of war or whatever you want to say, either somebody's tired, somebody's delirious, somebody's excited, scared, combination of everything. There's a couple of guys that, let out, a couple of Japanese guys that basically kind of blow their cover. They let out a battle cry, if you will. Yeah. And then that lets everybody in the area know, oh, hey, somebody's over there. And then they cut loose. The Marines cut loose. The machine gun fire is aided by mortar fire as well. And this is, let's see, how many guys, this is attacking around, how many guys is this, Dave, you think? Japanese?
Well, they had the 29th Regiment, which is one of the best Japanese regiments in existence. I mean, they'd set all these marching records, and they're supposed to be the toughest guys, some of the toughest troops it had. So and roughly there were around 3,000 of them. But once again, they wouldn't attack it in mass.
Sure. So
the first night, actually, they didn't hit in the concentrated attack. It was the second night that really hit them hard. But with the 29th, so they had like one battalion, and maybe 2 battalions fully deployed, and they were feeding them in piecemeal. So you're only looking, I think Basilone and his guns was credited with basically destroying a Japanese company. So maybe 150 guys to 200 guys. Mm-hmm. So one battalion was basically decimated in the first few hours of the 29th Regiment.
Right.
And so unless your name is MacArthur, am I beating a dead horse, Seth? The Medal of Honor is not awarded unless it's an enormous example of bravery. And in the case of Basilone, can you describe what that action was that resulted in his citation?
Yeah, I won't go because I'm cognizant of the time, but I won't go into too much detail. But yeah, there's a lot of, I haven't found a good book or good account, accurate account of Basilone. There's a lot of, bits and pieces. The way I've based my research is actually 4 years of studying this action, 2 years on the ground walking where the incident occurred, studying it in detail, looking at it from a point of view of a former Marine heavy machine gun sergeant, platoon sergeant, which I was, reviewing all the reports, all the message logs, everything I can get my hands on. And more importantly, I've had Basilone's own testimony that he gave to Marine officers under an official interview in September of 43, back in the States on his tour. And he goes into a lot of detail. It's like these two officers he was under a police interview because I asked him open questions. And Basilone, being the guy that he was, very modest, they said, "What happened?" And he just briefly describes it. Then they start drilling down. And it was such a great transcript because they drill down in so much detail.
Like an interrogation.
Oh yeah, they said, "Oh, how many rounds you fire? How what was the distances? What did you do?" So basically, once again, Basilone and his guns were covering that vital Sector 3 trail. The Japanese started coming in. He was in the left bunker with his two guns, and they wasn't not four guns by themselves. They had Marines riflemen, they had more than 60, 60s behind them. They had other machine gun bunkers. There were guys all around them. These accounts that Basilone was acting alone, which is false. I mean, hell, we had 500 guys around him, but they were protecting that vital track, which is an avenue of approach for the Japanese and one of their main avenue attack points. So Basilone initially, he heard that they were coming. He says A Company started engaging. His guns to the left started supporting some of the A Company guys. So he was in the middle of C Company's lines. And then a runner came over. The bunker is only 30 yards apart. Came over and said, "Our right bunker's been taken out." So Basilone grabbed a 1917 heavy machine gun with a tripod on it. And he had a small, low-mounted tripod that fit on a light machine gun.
Like a 1919, yeah.
Then he took the tripod, put it on his back, spread eagle, and he took two other guys with him. And it's only 30 yards, but basically what they did, they had tracks. They had a 100-yard parallel supply track behind all the bunkers. So he basically ran with his three guys 50 yards back, or sorry, no, they had 50. It was 50 yards behind. So he ran 50 yards back, 30 yards down, and 50 yards back up, like a dog, like a offset.
Like a U, yeah, boom.
Yeah, like a U. So he said in his own testimony, he said between going from one bunker to the other, they ran into 6 to 8 Japanese, and he says we took care of them. So I think some people have taken the artistic license or whatever to have Basilone firing from the hip with the gun and killing all the Japanese. If he did that, he had to fire that gun with that tripod mounted, and he had to have it fully loaded.
And in fact, that's the way the series Pacific portrays it, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, he didn't have a tripod in the Pacific, but he clearly states, and I have other supported evidence, he had a tripod. And think about it, he's a professional heavy machine gunner. He's not going to take a machine gun without a tripod.
Right.
Just in case, they said the bunker's taken out. He gets over there, and if all guns are destroyed, he's got a gun with no, it just doesn't make sense.
So if he doesn't manhandle the machine gun, how did he take care of those guys?
No. Thinking of my heavy machine gun training, I'm thinking this is a bit silly to do that. Anyway, Basilone wasn't a silly man. So they ran over. Anyway, he gets to his other bunker. He said there was a guy, Evans. There was 2 Marines still there. And Evans, he said, was the most bravest Marine he ever seen. He was firing his 03, yelling at the top of his lungs, shooting at the Japanese. The other Marines had been taken out. He said the killed and wounded had been taken out. So in saying that means it was a bit of a time frame for the dead to be taken out. I guess they were maybe wounded and taken out. He gets there. He got the 2 Marines firing. He said, I take my gun, I lay it in jungle flat right beside the bunker. It was 2 feet away from the discovered bunker. I lay it down. I go into the bunker. He said, in his own words, one of the machine guns was busted. He said the other one wasn't working. He said, so I cleared it. And he mentions he cleared it in less than a minute. It was a double feed. So he said he cleared the double feed. And in the Pacific series, that's very accurate how they go. Right. He clears it, and you see the boat fly home, and it's ready to rock and roll, and guns in action. So he basically said, "Oh, the other guys got a bit excited and couldn't clear it." That's what he told the Marine officers. So he started firing that gun, and he said, "I'd roll out 2 feet away and fire the gun in the jungle flat. And I'd roll back and forth. And I would load my own gun. And the other guys were providing cover fire. He said, I took my .45 pistol and laid it right beside me on the ground. He said, and every once in a while they'd yell out, if I'm in a bunker, there's a Japanese behind me. And I turn around and I take care of the Japanese behind me. Because you got to remember, the Japanese,
Yeah, they're moving everywhere.
Pretty much
we're zooming right past them. They're still infiltrating through. There's Japanese everywhere. But he's holding them off with those machine guns. And they're stacking them up on that wire in that vital Sector 3 track. Remember, the 37 millimeters are going off. You got other Marines left and right supporting. There's guns, and you got artillery, you got mortar fire firing all around there. But Basilone is holding those guys off on that vital avenue of approach. And another thing, artistic license, I think, where it shows, especially in the movie Pacific, where Basilone runs out and starts pulling the bodies off the wire.
He
didn't do that. What he did was, he didn't clearly state that he ran out and pulled bodies off. But he said, I kept moving my gun in the jungle flat around, 2 or 3 meters here, 2 or 3 meters there, moving it back and forth. Why is he moving it around? To get a clear field of fire.
Yep.
Of course. He's not going to run out there. And in fact, one stage, there was a Japanese machine gunner behind a wall of dead bodies doing and firing at them. So he's moving his guys back and forth. So he was only left with 2 guys. The other guys were getting wounded. But what Basilone did, which was very amazing, at one stage, they were running out of ammunition. So he knew he was 150 yards back was an ammunition point. So instead of running straight back, because he knew the Japanese had infiltrated, what Basilone did, he ran out in front of all the other Marine bunkers and ran down the bunker line. Japanese are running everywhere. Marines are firing. He ran down the jungle line barefooted because he took his boondockers off, or his shoes, because to get better traction, because it's all muddy in that area. And that's what the locals do. And if you wouldn't know this unless you actually walk through there, because you're wearing Western style shoes, you'll slip and fall because the mud gets.
Well, they had leather bottoms in those days too.
Yeah. So he's threw his shoes off and he's running barefooted. And none of this deal about a machete or anything like that. That's another myth. He didn't mention anything about machete. So he runs back, gets the ammunition. He didn't say how. He says, when I came back, I had to get to the clearing, and I crawled through the clearings, and I'd run through the jungle to crawl through the clearings. And obviously, when he ran back, he didn't have belts of machine gun because there's so much ammunition. I picture he had boxes of ammunition to preserve the integrity of these bullets. And Basilone was a very strong fellow, according to the report. So he pulled them boxes back, and he brought some ammunition. And the 2 Marine officers asked him, it was quite funny. I could see probably Basilone smiling at him or laughing or thinking in his head, well, these guys know. Because I asked him a question. They said, oh, but the guns wasn't empty with machine gun bullets before you ran back? He goes, no, I've left 4 belts just in case they needed to fire some more rounds. It's an obvious question. But what Basilone was saying, it wasn't a massive rush. He said they came in small bunches. He said he could fire for 30 minutes and then they wouldn't fire for 10, 15 minutes. And he'd fire for 10 minutes and wouldn't fire for 30 minutes. And this went on all through the night. He said when it got to daybreak, he thought this is where they do a mass attack, but they never did. And he goes on to say how many rounds each gun fired. And when daybreak came, Basilone, they counted 38 bodies between him and the wire, which was only 33 feet away. And there was a number of bodies on the other side of the wire. You get some reports saying, Basilone killed, 900 guys, which isn't true. There was a whole bunch of Marines standing behind him. Basilone and his guns were credited with basically wiping out a Japanese company or stopping a Japanese company, which is roughly 100 to maybe 150 guys. But over just like any legend, I think the story's told, retold, secondhand, thirdhand. News reporters gets hold of it and they go, well, this doesn't sell paper, so to speak. So we'll just inflate it a bit.
Exaggerate it.
Paul Basilone was, and I'd say Paul Basilone, the Marine Corps and the powers that be used him. And you see that's portrayed quite accurately in the Pacific, where they brought him back for War Bonds tour. Young, single, good-looking Marine. He was the first enlisted Marine. Thomason of the Second Raiders was the first to earn one
get the medal,
in the war.
But he was first to receive it.
Basilone was the first living one. They needed to sell War Bonds tours, and he became a rock star, basically rock star status through the war. And then this whole story, Basilone, he wanted to go back. to his credit, which is he wanted to go back with his boys. He had to make a personal appeal to the commandant. He unfortunately died on 19th of February in Iwo Jima, leading from the front like a good Marine platoon sergeant.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get too bogged down. I know we
and we don't want to make
story of Basilone.
We don't want to make the episode. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we don't want to make the episode about Basilone. He's an example of the bravery and heroism that most of the Marines exhibited during this battle.
Oh yeah, there was another platoon.
He's a bit extraordinary, though.
Yeah.
He's a bit extraordinary.
And the whole story about him going for 3 days, that's another myth. After when the morning time came, 1-7 moved up on Bloody Ridge. They consolidated position because the Army moved in and took their position. Right. So they consolidated his battalion on Bloody Ridge, and they didn't receive any more fighting after that. So Basilone was only really involved for, at the most,
a night,
6-7 hours.
Yeah, a night. So after this heroic, and it is, let's be abundantly clear, this heroic episode is over, or not over, but as it's going on, I should say. Chesty Puller's he's fully aware. He's fully aware that he's under attack by a large, very experienced, heavy Japanese assault. He knows he needs to feed more people into the lines. This is where some of the 164th start coming into the lines. The Marines and the Army, these guys are National Guardsmen. They're intermingled, sometimes in the same bunker, sometimes in the same, well, certainly in the same lines, but sometimes in the same positions. These guys, this is their baptism, this particular group of National Guardsmen, this is their baptism of fire. They're being led sometimes by hand, literally, up in the dark. Yeah, in the dark, in the rain, up to this, pitched battle. They account themselves very, very, very well. These aren't your, not to degrade them in any way, but these aren't your hardcore, Marines. These are National Guardsmen. These are guys that are.
Where was this guard unit from?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Yeah, South Dakota. Okay. South Dakota.
Farm boys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Puller said these farm boys can fight.
Yeah, and that they did, and this is their baptism of fire. They're being thrown in, the biggest assault by the Japanese on the American lines, and they acquit themselves quite well, very, very well. He being Puller uses them to plug holes in his line pretty much all night long, right, Dave? I mean, he's grabbing these people and saying, go here, take these guys and bring them here. And he's plugging holes in the dike with these soldiers all night long. And they do their job. They fight, tooth and nail, just like the Marines do here. And this is really the first time that the United States Army gets involved in this heavy infantry combat in the Pacific Theater side, outside of the fall of the Philippines. And they acquit themselves quite well. The only real success of the Japanese assaults this night specifically is in the form of a gentleman named Colonel Furamaya. He makes an assault at dawn, or roughly thereabouts, right, Dave? And they actually do break through the Marine/Army lines at one point, do they not?
Yeah, so he was the regimental commander of the 29th Regiment.
Yeah, he was a big.
Him and a small group of guys penetrated through, and I found their position. I mean, by about 100 yards in, so it had a small area about 100 yards in, 50, 60 yards wide, small pocket. So they infiltrated in, and they were holding up there. And then when the morning time came, the Marines basically wiped out that pocket. But he was there, and he sent a few guys back. We know a bit about him because he wrote a diary. Yeah, and he made a lot of notes in his diary. And what he did before it was over was he sent his diary with a young Japanese officer to make it back to report. But unfortunately for the Japanese officer, he was shot and killed by the Marines, and the diary was captured. And in his diary, the colonel takes full credit for the disastrous loss. He said, it's basically my fault. We've underestimated this. And he makes some poignant remarks, like in the fact that don't underestimate the firepower of these Americans. He was only in the daytime he was about 50, 60 yards away from a Marine bunker, and he was making observations. he said these guys would fire sporadically, little bursts every once in a while. And he said, is this electric? They thought they might be electrically initiated. They had the Marines had sensors out that any movement that these automatically would fire, because they didn't know why they were firing. And the Japanese, if you read the reports, thought that the Americans had electronic sensors everywhere, and that's how they picked them up. But yeah, he ended up killing himself, and he couldn't burn the colors because it would draw attention. So he cut the colors up and he buried them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the only penetration, big penetration they had. So the pocket was wiped out by mid the next day.
And
that was the largest Japanese. The next night was the largest Japanese assault.
Right, and this is 25 October. This is the night of 25 October. By 25 and then 26. By mid morning, it's pretty obvious that the Japanese are, while that assault was severe, this is not the end of the offensive. As a result of this, the Marines and the Army, they're shuffling their people around. They're starting to hem in the lines and reinforce the positions in which they think are going to be hit again. That night, sure enough, lo and behold, the Japanese do assault again. They're firing their artillery into the positions of Pullers 1-7 and Lieutenant Colonel, a guy named Robert Hall. He's the commanding officer of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The majority of this Japanese assault that's coming is coming down this. It's not terribly far from where the assault was the previous night, is it, Dave? What did we talk about mileage wise or feet wise here?
Yeah, so you mentioned Soji. When Soji's men in that first attack the night before, they hit this line in A Company. So it was at that stage, when I talk about Basilone, they'd moved 1-7, they'd moved them away from that area and put them up on the ridge to consolidate. And 3rd Battalion of the 164th came in and took over where the jungle flat, and they hooked in with the 2nd Battalion of the 164th at a jeep trail, which later became known as a place called Coffin Corner, which was the open line, and that was the main track through that open field. It went into Fighter 1. That was going to be the focal point of the Japanese attack. And if you look at the firing plans, I mean, just on both sides of that trail was 2 37mm guns, 50 cals, 30 cals. There's a lot of good reports on it, and there's firing plans, and it was just, it was pretty bad. And then they had firing lanes set up with the barbed wire. So when the Japanese would hit a barbed wire line, it would draw them straight into that. So that was the focal point. And they call it Coffin Corner because a Marine said if he was a coffin maker, he'd make a fortune there. So they left the 7th Marine heavy guns there, like 37mm. They still manned it, but the 1-7 had moved out. And the Army basically, with the exception of those Marines 37, that was their show that night. And massive Japanese assaults, American artillery hitting in the fields. They killed, estimated just that night alone, about 1,500 Japanese. And if you go to my videos, there's I've got some where the Japanese burial trenches were with the bulldozers, 3 large trenches, and they put hundreds of Japanese in there, which the body's been pulled out and cremated since. But yeah, that was a focal point of Japanese attack, and they were basically decimated there, mainly by the Army and the Marine artillery.
Let's talk about our old friend that we've mentioned quite often, Colonel Oka. Colonel Oka, who seemingly has a hand in almost, with the exception of Tenaru, has a hand in, or a finger or a fingernail in almost every single Japanese offensive, assault, whatever you want to call it, on the island. He is here as well. His attacks, he's not to be left out. He's not to be denied any glory here either. His attacks focus on that area that's held by Hannikin's people, right? 2-7.
Yeah, that was the worst. Earlier up on the Matanicow, you had a 2 forward battalion of 2 forward deployed battalions, exposed left flank, which is now called Cola Ridge in modern day. So they pulled 2-7 out and put them up on that ridge on the 24th. And they go up the Manda Ridge. I think during the day they get some mortar fire. There's a small skirmish of Japanese that overrun an outpost. But they could see Oka's troops at night moving. They could see the lights of the campfires and things. They could see them below them. And they were ready for the attack. And on the night of the 25th, 26th, Oka's 124th, reinforced, made an assault up that ridge. against 2-7 positions.
There was one Marine in one of those positions by the name of Mitchell Paige. Much like Basilone, he was also, in charge of some automatic weapons. Dave, can you lay it on us about Mitch Paige? What does this Marine Corps legend do this night?
Yeah. So in my opinion, not to belittle what anyone else had done, Medal of Honor earners, but in my opinion, on Guadalcanal on land, Mitch Paige's Medal of Honor incident was to me the most miraculous or amazing feat. So Paige was just like Basilone, he was a pre-war Marine platoon sergeant. He'd been in the Marine since the early 30s, China Marine, everything you can think of, all-star baseball pitcher. And he had a platoon of Marines, and he actually had some, I call it souped up guns. I forgot what he called it. Him and the captain had worked out if they could drill some holes in the boats of these heavy machine guns, it'd make the boat go faster, make machine gun fire faster, which they did. I think he called them his rapid fire guns or quick guns. So he had them up there. So once again, he had a number of heavy machine guns, and they've put his guys up on a knoll. So if you ever read a book, it's called a Marine named Mitch. It's about Paige, his autobiography, and there's a lot of on YouTube. Paige describes his Medal of Honor incidents too, and my friend Joe Mueller was on Guadalcanal with Paige in the 1970s, and Paige used to take trips and tours and lead people over there. So he took Joe around, and Joe took me around. But anyway, I've got a whole episode on Paige. What Paige did, they put his guns up on exposed knoll. He had to set his guns up at night when he moved up there, and he mentions he would feel, and when the cliff would drop off, he knew he'd put his guns there. But when daylight came, he was on exposed knoll. And the night before, they could hear the Japanese, and he was throwing grenades. And what he did was the next day, he took his K-bar knife out. It said it took him 2 hours. He cut the sleeves out of his dunger or his utility top, so he could throw a grenade faster and better because he was a baseball pitcher. But anyway, when the Japanese attacked, they hit his knoll. They concentrated upon his knoll. He'd lost a lot of Marines killed and wounded. Company F was on his left flank. Company G was on his right flank. The Japanese had overran Company F. In fact, at one stage, Company F was running. They were moving back to the next ridge. Paige got so mad at him, he grabbed an 03 Springfield and took a shot at some of the Marines running away. And he says that quite clearly in his book. He was pretty pissed off, he said, pretty mad. But it left Paige up there by himself. So what Paige was doing is running back and forth to the machine guns and firing, basically. And Paige was holding this knoll literally by himself. And at one stage, his guns, 2 or 3 guns, he's running back and forth and firing, were the only guns firing on the Marines line, heavy guns, machine guns.
Machine guns.
Because you can think all the Japanese fire was concentrated on his machine guns, because obviously in a firefight, you want to try to suppress the rapid firing guns. So they're getting a lot of attention. So the Japanese had infiltrated to his left flank, and he looked, and he knew the Japanese were about to hit the forward battalion command post under Major Connolly. They were on the reverse slope. He looked and he seen the Japanese, so he swung his gun around. He started firing at the Japanese. The Marines in the command post heard the bullets going over the top of the head, and they thought, well, they've overran Paige's guns and the Japanese are shooting at us. But what he was doing, he was hitting the Japanese from behind. In fact, after the battle, they looked at some of the dead Japanese that had bullet holes in their soles of the shoes and in the back of the legs where Paige was hitting them with grazing fire. That was the only place he could fire his grazing fire up there, which is roughly about 6-7 inches off the ground. And at one stage, he's ran over to the G Company, got a couple of Marines, got another gun, moved him over, and he got pinned down again. And he tells a great story that when he's moving back, you could see one Japanese looking at an exposed Marine gun, and a foot race. And he's made it to the gun, swung around to kill the Japanese before you get to the gun. And then he's still holding them off, him and those 2 guys from G Company. And then at one stage, Major Connolly got the cooks and the supply staff and everything else, and they did a counterattack. And when he's seen the Marines pushing the Japanese off the ridge, that's when he's picked the 1917 up, and then he's actually fired it from the hip. in conjunction with the G Company guys, and he said, "Let's go, let's charge these guys." And I know the hill that he was on, and he's straight down, and he's ran straight down the hill with the Major Connolly, the small squad of Marines. He's got some of the G Company guys supporting him. They've ran down the hill. Paige knew some Japanese because he'd stationed in China, and he yelled out, I forgot, stand up or get up or whatever. And some of the Japanese popped out of the bush, and he ended up shooting those guys. And he said it was a Japanese, he calls him a colonel, who knows, but a Japanese officer gets up with a sword and tries to take him on. But he said he cuts him down with the machine gun. And then after he wiped out this small group of him and the other Marines, kills this small group of Japanese, then the attack was over.
So he shoots the machine gun from the hip for real, the thing that Basilone was credited with doing but never did?
Yeah, well, once again, Basilone never says he fired it in his official accounts. So I don't know if he told it to reporters. You read reporter accounts and maybe third or fourth hand from other people. But Basilone did burn his arms. So how Basilone burned his arms, he burned his arms on the
water jackets.
He's picking the gun up.
Yeah.
When he picks the gun up, you imagine a gun on a tripod. You're not going to pick it up by the tripod. You're going to like cradle it in the arms and pick it up that way. He burned his arms that way. But Paige burned his arms, and he mentioned I forgot what the salve the corpsman gave him after that to put up and down his arms. He almost like second-degree burns up and down his forearm. But yeah, so Paige and the other Marines basically held him off, and that ended Oka's attack.
Yeah, I've seen photos of him. He did not look like a very big guy, Paige, but incredible things he did.
He's pretty stout. I've got a picture of him. Yeah, or he was. God bless him. I've got a picture of him, and I'll have to send it to you guys later, and I'll put it on the video version of this podcast of him later. He's sitting there in a camouflage uniform, kind of kicked back in a bunker. And this is not on Guadalcanal. This is later on. I want to say it's a Cape Gloucester.
I'd love to see that one on Guadalcanal.
Yeah. It's not on the canal, but he's a pretty good sized dude. And I've used this phrase before, and I'll use it again, talking about John Basilone, but especially Mitch Paige. Balls of solid rock. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah. Balls of solid rock.
I think Paige was overshadowed by Basilone for a number of reasons. One, he earned his Medal of Honor the next night. When they got back to Australia, they offered when they got to Australia, they offered Basilone. In fact, Basilone was offered a commission twice in his career, but when they got back to Australia, they offered Basilone a commission. He goes, "No, I'm a sergeant. I'm staying with my guy." They made him a platoon sergeant then. But Paige took the offer up and became in fact, in December, he was given a battlefield promotion on Guadalcanal. So they got back to.
I saw him referred to as a colonel, so he got promoted pretty aggressively, didn't he?
Well, he retired.
Yeah. So when they got back to Australia, that's where they got their medals, and a famous ceremony there, and a famous picture of them on Balmoral Oval near Melbourne. But I think they needed to send someone back for a war bonds tour. So he had Paige. Paige was married, older Marine, an officer. He had Basilone, single, young, good-looking Marine, enlisted man. The first Marine enlisted man. So what's going to sell more bonds, you think? What's more marketable? Of course, Basilone is more marketable. And I don't know about the personality wise. I'd say Basilone is probably, more social. From what I get, he's a real fun guy. Guys love being around him, so that means he's very sociable. So once again, so I think that was the reason he was overshadowed by Basilone. And you don't hear much about Paige's exploits until you really start to read on it and drill down on it. Both, don't get me wrong, both are well deserving. I'm not saying anything about disregarding anyone. But it's quite amazing. In fact, all the Medal of Honors given on land for enlisted men were all machine gunners, all 5.
On Guadalcanal.
On Guadalcanal, sorry. Yeah, 2 Army and 3 Marines.
Yeah. Wow.
Which shows you the defensive nature of the fighting.
And I was going to say this later, but I'll say it now. For those of you who haven't seen Dave's videos, please see them. Dave, you did such a service to everybody interested in this battle by documenting, because many of these sites you're talking about are surrounded by houses and, built modern roads, and, a brewery in one case, isn't it? And so, to document those before they're all gone is really important to his history. So you've done a real service with these videos, and you're walking the battlefield. And I want to thank you for that. So important to the preservation.
Absolutely. And they're very well done. They're 110% accurate too. And they're just freaking cool. I mean, if you're a student of the topic, if you're a student of the campaign, specifically the ground campaign, you're not going to find anything better than these, I should say. So the battle peters out, or the offensive peters out after this. The casualties, something we always talk about in any event, the casualties the Marines and the Army suffer, it's under 100, but it's roughly about 90 plus or minus.
You're talking KIA now, not
yeah. So I'm sorry, not casualties, killed in action, 90 roughly. Do we have an estimate on Japanese casualties, Dave? I've seen numbers anywhere from 1,500 to I keep saying casualties. Deaths, I've seen anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000. Do we have any kind of semi-accurate estimation of Japanese KIAs in this event?
You have to go to probably Richard Frank's book.
That's where I got him.
Yeah. I'd say there's probably, I've heard anywhere up to 2,500 dead. Then you're not counting the ones of the 2nd Division that had to make their way back. You remember, they're 35 miles there in thick jungle. They got to go 35 miles back. And to this day, if you go into the thick jungle there's still Japanese skeletons from those guys. So that's not counting those guys. There's probably in the hundreds it died from that.
Yeah.
From the wounded or diseased and starved, making their way back. Because who knows? I mean, it would be, I'd say it could be up to 3,000 Japanese out of we talked about this before. They sent their first team to Guadalcanal. The Japanese did, and we did too. But their first team. So they decimated the 2nd Division. The 2nd Division.
Would make an exchange rate of 30-1 if that's true. Killed in action.
That's accurate. I mean, it or pretty accurate. It's no secret. Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that this. We've made a big point in this throughout these whole series of episodes on Guadalcanal, that, by the way, still ain't done, that this was the meat grinder. This is the turning point. This is the battle of attrition that the Japanese, be it Navy or Army or whatever, is not going to win. There are times where they come close. Close. And by close, I'm talking about achieving their objective of capturing their airfield or eliminating the U.S. Navy. But in the grand scheme of things, this is the sausage grinder. This is the meat grinder that eventually spells their doom. And by that, I mean, the war, their war effort. This is it. And this is a perfect example of it. They throw their very best, or what they feel is their very best at this offensive, and they're chopped to pieces. They're chopped to pieces by, and there's a lot of things that the Japanese threw the blame on for their failures, and probably they're all accurate. They listed the terrain, the march through the jungle, the American air power, the American superiority in artillery, the American superiority in battlefield firepower, disease, lack of food, lack of supplies. All of those are 100% accurate in terms of the Japanese effort. Yeah. But the fact of the matter remains is that they did make contact with American combatants, and they were soundly defeated at every single turn, almost every single turn, specifically in this offensive.
Should mention for, I guess, your listeners to have a look at it. The 25th was called Dugout Sunday, which showed the massive amount of Japanese air effort to try to subdue, because I forgot how many Japanese planes where they were smashing the airfield. It was combined assault. So we haven't mentioned obviously the air in this, but yeah, Dugout Sunday was a day to have a look at.
And that's absolutely perfect to bring up, because we've said this in an earlier episode, I don't remember which one anymore now, that almost every single Japanese offensive on land on Guadalcanal is accompanied by a naval offensive, or certainly at the very least naval support. And it's one area of the campaign that we haven't really touched on at all is the air war, and it's something I would like to do eventually. But I mean, this is all encompassing. This Japanese offensive here at the end of October, well, yeah, I mean, this is the end of October. At the end of October, encompasses a massive assault, massive offensive on land. It encompasses an air offensive the following day, and on October 26th, it's also a carrier battle, the Battle of Santa Cruz. So, I mean, this is not, this isn't by chance that these things happen. This is the Japanese are throwing everything at this offensive. But it isn't the last time that the Japanese try and do this. It's not the last time that the Japanese try and reinforce Guadalcanal. They do have plans to make this one more time in the month of November. And to a point they do, but not to this extent, right, Dave? I mean, this is the last major Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal.
Yes, you're correct. It's probably one of the last major Japanese offenses in the whole Pacific campaign. If you don't, there was another one in Bougainville, I think 44. But yeah, after that, it was just defensive banzai attacks, but not a coordinated offensive operation.
Right.
This is the last, hoorah, so to speak, for the Japanese, not counting Bougainville.
And if you think about that in the context of where we are in the war, we are in October 1942. Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941. This is, for all intents and purposes, the last major Japanese combined arms offensive of the war in October 1942. And yet it still takes us till September 1945 to bring these people to the surrender table. That'll tell you, A, about the size of the Japanese empire. And I'm talking about over the expanse of the Pacific. B, the tenacity of their defense, which we're going to see over and over and over again. And just the sheer size and massive complexity of this entire war, that it all starts in December, and for better or worse, it's pretty much decided. There's a lot of war left to fight yet by October 1942. So I mean, it's incredible when you really think about it, and it all happens here on Guadalcanal, in the seas around Guadalcanal, and in the air above it.
So for the comments, I know someone will comment, the last Japanese offensive in the Pacific, not China, Burma, India. We're not talking about that.
Right. Yeah.
They did some
sure.
offenses in China and Burma. Yeah. So
Kohima and Fall, all that stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Ready
for sure.
for a comment.
Yeah.
I'm not forgetting the Brits.
Believe you me, if somebody will point that out, I guarantee you. I'm talking about from the American perspective. Yes. In the South Pacific and eventually the Central Pacific Drive. This is kind of it. I know you could talk about it more, Dave. I know you're pressed for time, and I know the listeners would love to hear it more or hear more about it. But do you have anything else you want to throw in before we wrap this sucker up?
Oh, no, I think we've hit the main points. And once again, it's a very important stage of the Guadalcanal campaign. Mm-hmm. And just I guess the listeners and the viewers just to research a little bit further on it. There's a lot of good resources on it. So yeah, and some of the people we've discussed before, a lot more research on those guys too, a lot more information out there. Yeah. So yeah, enjoy talking about it.
Well, we're definitely not done with you, Dave. If you'd be willing to hang around with us again, one time or two times or however many times you want to, frankly.
Well, I love to discuss the U.S. Army, because many don't even realize that other than they thought U.S. Army did a mopping up campaign, which isn't correct. So I'm trying to rectify it as best I can.
I'd like to talk about
thanks
that.
You.
You can't talk enough about the 164th guys. Yeah. In fact, they call themselves the 164th Marines after this, and Colonel Hall got a Navy Cross, and they got a presidential unit citation for the 1st Marine Division. Because you got to remember, the 164th at this stage was part of the 1st Marine Division.
Right.
Incorporate them in. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. No, but
talk about it.
Definitely want to talk about the Army, talk about the GFU and all that jazz, as it's going in, and we're picking up the offensive there on Guadalcanal. But that's at a later date. Bill, you got anything you want to add?
No, it was great to chat with you again, Dave, and so lucky to have you with these conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again, Dave, for everything you've done for us, and we appreciate it. And, I've loved every minute of it so far. And we're not done, but so with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and a review. Also, if you want to see the video version of this and any of other episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Also, look us up on Facebook, like and subscribe to our page there as well. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Again, I say it every time, but I'm going to say it again. Check out Dave's Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield Facebook and YouTube channel. You will not be disappointed. He takes you to these very places that we talked about today and in every other episode we've done with Dave, and the ones we're going to do in the future too. So once again, I want to thank you very much for listening and watching. My name is Seth Paradin. Thank you, Bill.
And I'm Bill Tody. Thank you, and see you next time.
Dave, thank you, man.
Yeah, enjoyed it. See you,
Semper Fi. All right. Thanks, guys.